We are really grateful for Delta State helping host this Zoom meeting and panel tonight. And without further ado, let me go ahead and introduce our panelists. And first up, I'd like to introduce Marisa Louie Lee. If you have seen her film, you'll know that the National Archives played a very, very important role in our film. We didn't know Marisa back then, and had we gone there earlier, we would have maybe met her because she used to work at the National Archives in San Francisco, and she's also been at the Chinese Historical Society of America. She's also lectured at the Salt Lake Institute of Genealogy, California Genealogical Society, Japanese American National Museum, and she is also a proud alumna of the Roots program, which is a program that you get to go back to China and visit your village and trace your roots, and she might share a little bit more about that later. And we are also very honored to have Grant Din, who has been interested in genealogy ever since his cousin told him 40 years ago that he was the 36th generation of Gongs. So he's done a lot of lineage research here. Since that time, he's researched his and many families' immigration histories. He's been on the staff of Angel Island Immigration Station Foundation and currently serves on the board of the California Genealogical Society. He enjoyed being part of the team that researched the new documentary about the 6 Chinese seamen who survived the Titanic in the film The Six. And the next couple of presenters that I'm going to introduce have a very interesting connection because both of them are not born in the United States. Both of them were born in the same country, which is the Netherlands. Let me introduce first John de Jong, who has worked at FamilySearch for 9 years, and he leads the North American partner team as they work to enable people to discover and connect with their family members. He works with the archive. His team works with their archives, libraries, and museums and courts in other places and record custodians to preserve and provide web access to genealogical significant records. And last but not least, Huihan Lie, yes, he was born in the Netherlands and is of Chinese ethnicity. There are Chinese Dutch. And I know, Huihan, you're like, you're always amazed when people think that's a novelty, but we're Americans, so everything's a novelty if it's not American to us. And he is the founder and CEO of My China Roots, and he has successfully helped hundreds of families trace their Chinese ancestors. He was born and raised in the Netherlands with family in Indonesia and ancestors from China, and he is currently based in Beijing, so it is early morning for him. He studied at Columbia University in New York and has a law degree from the University of Amsterdam. He's been featured in the New York Times, BBC, and The Economist, and he has actually helped us do a little bit of tracking of our family. And we are so delighted to have this awesome panel here with us today, or this evening, depending on where you are, right, Huihan? So, a lot to talk about. First off, I'm going to reintroduce Baldwin because he just came into the picture. For those of you who just joined us.
Trying to get our daughter situated.
For those of you who are just joining us and wondering who are these two people, my name is Larissa Lamb. I am the director of Far East Deep South. And I like to say I became an accidental genealogist through the tracing of Baldwin's family roots, which is depicted in our film. We went on this crazy trip to Mississippi. It wasn't crazy at first. It was just a family vacation in search of your great-grandfather and grandfather's gravesite.
And we found a whole lot more.
And we found a whole lot more. Next thing you know, we meet Emily Jones, who is here with us today, and we unlock all these secrets and hidden history of not just your family, but that of the Chinese in the Mississippi Delta during segregation. And we learn about how the Chinese Exclusion Act directly impacted your family. So if you haven't had a chance to see the film yet, I think it was in your emails, but we'll send out an email reminder again. But the film is available to view if you're in the United States. I know we have a few people that are joining us that are outside of the United States today. It is available to view in the United States on pbs.org up until June 3rd for free. And we will drop those links in a little bit later. Okay, let's get started here, everyone. Oh wait, did I introduce you? You're Baldwin Chiu. I didn't. We're married, by the way.
Yeah, I'm just here for eye candy. So she's gonna do most of the talking. I'm just here for you to look at every once in a while. It's just, at your leisure.
Yes, I see we have somebody from Singapore. So yes, thank you for joining us. Yes, Baldwin is my husband, and his family he's the producer of the film, and his family is the subject of Far East Deep South. Okay, enough opening chatter.
Let's get started.
People always ask us how we dug up more information beyond showing up in Mississippi and meeting Emily Jones here. And Baldwin, I know you personally have used websites like FamilySearch. That was key, wasn't it, to finding certain things?
It was very key. All the initial search that we did, our initial search was talking to people, but our second wave was to actually do some search online. So using resources like FamilySearch, we were able to track down some documents. Actually, we were able to do a whole bunch of switching of names and spellings, and was able to finally find some documentation of my family. And then we sent it over to the archives.
And so we have with us from FamilySearch, John to Jong. And John, I wanted to ask you first, can you share a little bit more about these records that FamilySearch has, and how are you actually collecting these records? Because until we went on this journey, I didn't realize the depth of records that FamilySearch actually had.
Yeah, certainly. So FamilySearch has been gathering records probably in earnest since 1938, when microfilming became a way to more easily record and preserve records. And so we started in the United States and also in Europe, microfilming old church records and government records, and have continued to do that. It's become digital. We actually built a vault here in the Salt Lake City area in the mountains, and we have about 2.5 million rolls of microfilm that are there. And we have been digitizing those microfilm rolls since 2000. And we expect to be finished sometime this year. So we have several billion images online already. And then with the help of just millions of volunteers, we've been able to index many of these records to make it easier to find your family, so that you can type in a name and up will come the records that name is particularly tied to. Now, if it's John Smith, you're going to find a lot of records for John Smith that may not be the John Smith you're looking for. But it certainly is a way to get closer than having to go page by page by page through individual books. Our process today is we have over 330 cameras around the world that are taking pictures, and in courthouses, in churches, in museums, in historical societies, genealogical societies, anywhere there's a genealogically significant record that can be found. We do our best to set up a project and be able to take those pictures and make them available online. And a lot of people just are excited to work with us. We have a program every year called Roots Tech. We usually do that around February, and it's a big genealogical conference. It used to be held, or in the past, it's been going for 10 years. In the last 9 years, it was held in Salt Lake City, and we'd get about 25, 30,000 people. Now, for a genealogy conference, that's quite a few. But this year we had to go virtual. And we ended up getting almost 1.5 million people that signed in from all over the world. We had registrants from practically every country except I think 1 or 2. We broadcast it in 10 different languages. We had presentations in 40 different languages that people submitted. And at rootstech.org, check it out. We've got all of the presentations that were created for Rootstech, which is almost 2,000 presentations, are still there, and they're available for free for viewing to teach you how to find your family in different locations all around the world. Our mission is to help people find their family so that they can discover, gather, and connect with their families and find joy in doing so. And not just connecting with families in the past, but also families in the present. One of the things that we did at RootsTech was that for registrants, we had something called Relatives at RootsTech. And you could actually see how many people were online at that given moment that was your relative and how closely you're related. So it's a first cousin, second cousin, 10th cousin, 3 times removed, all sorts of relationships. And it's very interesting having spoken with a lot of people after RootsTech, how they just love the fact that they could connect with somebody in a foreign country that they didn't know that they had a cousin in that location, and start to collaborate in finding their families and doing work like that. So it's not just something about finding the dead, but it's also connecting with the living and having these connections throughout the world. So it's been really exciting, and it's really fun to see this group of people because of the variety of folks that we have here, and all the different places in the world that folks have lived and will continue to live as we move around and as we experience different things. It's just really neat to see that. I have, for example, I have a cousin who is half Japanese because one of my mom's uncles actually went to Japan, was a seafarer and a businessman, and had, found a beautiful Japanese woman and married her, and they had a wonderful life together. And so people connect all over the world. It's an amazing thing. So today we have, because of COVID, actually a number of our cameras are not taking pictures. We're hoping that we can bring them up quickly as things get better. But we've got these cameras that are taking about 175 million pictures per year. That's a lot of pictures.
That is a lot of pictures for sure.
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
we try to index them and make them available as quickly as possible. And that's also a lot of effort through the indexing program that we have on our website.
Yeah, and I know, like, for Roots Tech, I just put in the chat a link. We did a presentation, and I know some of the other presenters here may have done presentations in the past at Roots Tech, but it is a really great resource. And again, this year, if you go to the Roots Tech website, you can view all these various videos and about how to do different aspects of research for free. And John, I know that you have the lineage in the Netherlands. So with all how broad is the reach? You said is worldwide. Is it literally in every country that you have people working in?
So we have, it's not every country that we've got cameras in. Part of that is we only have 330 cameras. So we're not everywhere because of that limitation. And there's some places that are still difficult to get into because of maybe political situations or otherwise. And then there are other places that may not have as many records. Just one example is in Africa. There are many places in Africa where they didn't keep historically a lot of records going back in time, kind of like China. You've got stuff going back 4,000 years. In Europe, oftentimes records go back into the 1400s, but that's not the case in every part of the world. And what we do in Africa, for example, we're interviewing people in the different tribes. Usually there's somebody there that is a genealogist that knows the history and the connections of people. And so we're doing a lot of interviewing, gathering millions of names and putting together trees of people of African descent. And we're particularly happy to do that. There's a lot of interest. The United States people are very interested in trying to link back to their family in Africa. And the movie Roots, which was many years ago, but that struck a deep chord, and that's something that continues to be important to people as they want to connect and understand who they are and where they came from. So whatever method is out there that enables us to help to connect people together, we figure it out and we spend the time, effort, and energy. And I have to say that much of the work that's done is done by volunteers. There's probably about 5% of the people that are involved in doing our work for FamilySearch are paid employees.
Really?
And
Wow.
The majority of them are volunteers. Yes, we have a lot of people that just everywhere in the world, not just members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saint, who's our sponsor, but also people locally in communities who are very interested in understanding how their families were put together, where they came from, et cetera. And there are genealogies, as you all probably know, there's genealogy societies all over the world. And we are just happy to work with them locally to understand what records are important to them and to help them to preserve and protect them.
Yeah, well, no, we appreciate all the work that you're doing, and it's a very important resource. Now, there's one place that we were talking about earlier, the National Archives. After you did some search on FamilySearch, and we actually took, I think there were ship manifests and census documents we found on FamilySearch that we took the names, how it was, how your grandfather, how we saw them in those documents, and then we went to the National Archives where. Quickly to tell the story, Baldwin was born in San Francisco. We went to Mississippi to go look for his grandfather's gravesite. Then we made the short film called Finding Cleveland at first. This was back in 2015. Toured the country. We ended up in New York, and a woman during the discussion stood up and asked us a question. She said, "Have you seen your family's Chinese exclusion files?" And you said,
What are those?
What are those? We had no idea. And then she said, "Oh, you should go look for them. Like, where are they?" And she said, San Francisco. And we're
she's like, go back to where you came from.
in that case. And Marisa Louie Lee knows a lot about that because she used to work at the National Archives. Marisa, can you tell us a little bit more about those records? Because I know they don't just hold the Chinese exclusion files, but many more. Talk about nationally what they hold, and also specifically what is in the archives in San Francisco.
Yeah, so, John talked a lot about the records that are being made available through FamilySearch and digitally. And, that's a great place to start the kind of genealogy work that, Larissa, you and Baldwin did. But, we always like to say, doing genealogy online is kind of like the tip of the iceberg. And there's so much more that's available that haven't been digitized yet, that FamilySearch just hasn't gotten around to doing yet. And that's kind of like what you would find at the National Archives. So the National Archives holds records created by the federal government that have been deemed to have enduring historical value. These range from documents known as the Charters of Freedom, like the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, the Constitution, to federal court cases that have set precedent, to records that show how the federal government operated and was administered both in Washington, D.C., but around the country as well. So the National Archives has its headquarters in Washington, D.C. and in College Park, Maryland, but they also have regional facilities around the country that have the records that show how the federal government operated around the country. The government had jurisdiction over immigration processes during the Chinese exclusion period from 1882 to 1943, and this was done by various federal agencies that eventually became the Immigration and Naturalization Service. That's now the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. And these records that relate to the administration and enforcement of the Exclusion Acts, these are held by the National Archives. I always find it really, really incredible that these records that so intimately document the lives of our families are maintained in perpetuity by our government, that they are deemed to have that kind of historical value. So I worked at the National Archives at San Francisco. The National Archives is also called NARA, or NARA for short. And I had the opportunity when I worked there to work with the records relating to the Chinese Exclusion Act. My family is among these records, and actually my very first encounter with the National Archives with Chinese Exclusion records was looking into the history of my family when I was a sophomore in college. So that's how I got my start doing this. Since San Francisco was a major port of entry for Chinese immigrants, the collection of Chinese Exclusion Act records at NARA and San Francisco are immense. NARA at San Francisco also has the records for immigrants to Hawaii, to Honolulu, and that was another major port of entry for Chinese immigrants and their descendants. So in sum, there are records for persons of Chinese descent who entered the U.S. and traveled outside the U.S., say if you were, someone who was born here in the U.S. and you wanted to make a trip outside of the United States. So these records date to the Chinese exclusion period from 1882 to 1943, but also after 1943, because we know that the legacy of Chinese exclusion didn't end the minute that the Exclusion Act was repealed in 1943. There are individual case files. There are files that document other aspects of Chinese American communities, like business partnership case files. I always find that, it's crazy that enforcement of the Exclusion Act didn't end just at people, but it looked at communities as a whole. So that's what you'd find at NARA.
Yeah, there's also, it's again, different like people of different national origins, right, Marisa? Like it's not just restricted to the Chinese community, correct?
Yeah, at NARA at San Francisco, there's kind of a unique collection because there are records for individuals of other nationalities, like, folks from Japan, Japanese picture brides, immigrants coming from, the Punjab area of what's now India. But by and large, when you go to other National Archives facilities around the country, they are actually just Chinese, as if, enforcement of the Chinese Exclusion Acts was, one of the major focuses back then.
Yeah, and I see some people in the chat were also mentioning there's a lot of records in Seattle. We know many people came through Seattle. We know several people from the Mississippi Delta region. Their families did come through Seattle, and there are branches all over. I personally also visited the Washington, D.C. branch, and there's actually technically two, because there's one in Maryland as well, but the one in D.C. proper, which is a beautiful facility, and they kind of are, they're definitely more lax at the one in San Bruno in San Francisco than they are at D.C., where I like, people gave me funny looks like, you can't take pictures of anything outside of any room unless you're looking at your specific documents. But the Baldwin's father had to come in through a special bill that was passed by Senator Eastland. If you've seen our film, you'll kind of know this, because he didn't fall under the categories that were allowed, even though he came in 1952 after the Exclusion Act was repealed. He still didn't fall into any of the categories that he was allowed to come in under regular immigration, so that he had to have a special bill passed. And so I found that special bill because it's a congressional record in Washington, D.C. So there's a lot of helpful records there. I'm going to move on to Huihan. Thanks, Marissa, for a little insight in the National Archives, because the next step after the National Archives, people keep always asking us, it's like, okay, well,
are you going to go back to China?
And,
not in the way that other people tell me.
Right. Yes. Not in an insulting way, like go back to your China, but tracing our
family roots
to China. And so Huihan, that's what you do. You are like the detective of all things in China for family genealogy. Tell us about the records and the types of information that you're able to track down in China, and how far back do they really go?
Sure, yeah. So basically, there's so much to find. The stories, traces, people back in China. The one thing is that we always go to the village first. So basically the place where the ancestors were from, because that's where the bulk of the information is saved. And then what type of traces are still left there? These range from clan books, so jiapu or zupu in Mandarin, to ancestral holes with ancestral tablets with information on them, to tombstones, graves in the hills next to the village, typically. Of course, there's stories that you can ask from elderly people on the streets. They're people themselves. Like, for instance, with Baldwin's, in Baldwin's case, we went to Baldwin's ancestral village. So where both, I think definitely his great-great-grandfather, but also your grandfather, right, were born.
Yeah, in Sunwei or Xinghui, if it's in Mandarin, right? Yeah.
Exactly. So going back there, first of all we met up with people. So we found people, a cousin of Baldwin, the daughter of the sister of Baldwin's father, and we connected, as well as found ancestral holes and a generation poem and stories, basically. So yeah, it really comes down to the location. So finding the ancestral village. And then secondly, your question was, I think, how far can you go back? That's a bit more complicated in the sense that it's not uncommon that we can go back all the way to the Yellow Emperor, which he's a mythical figure. So, but he's said to have lived 2700 BC, so almost 5,000 years ago. Then the question becomes one of historical accuracy, like how credible is it that so many people can actually be linked back directly to the Yellow Emperor? And there we usually take the approach of the further back in history you go, the larger the grain of salt should be with which you should take that information. So typically families would migrate within China, mostly not voluntarily, but very often due to instances of social unrest, and not uncommonly that would coincide, those instances of social unrest, with changes of dynasties. So typically 300-year intervals within a certain place is not uncommon to see in your family history book. So then linking that to the question of how far back can you go and how historically accurate is that lineage. Typically, if you find the ancestral village where your last ancestor lived and was born, and basically take that line in that village, which is often about 300 years, that's historically accurate. And then, the further back you go, again, the more often wishful thinking came into play in drafting these family trees, and very often families wanted to link themselves up with famous celebrities from the past.
Celebrities like only one? No.
Exactly,
It's pretty.
exactly.
By the way, if you don't know, Baldwin has an alter ego as a hip hop artist, and I know his dad is on this call right now, so I probably
like
shouldn't mention that
shaking
because
his head.
he doesn't like and approve of the hip hop. So we'll move on. But thanks, Huihan, for
Well,
a little.
maybe Huihan can find the first Chinese rapper in China.
I think Chinese
Ooh.
opera, in a sense,
Chinese
is a
opera
little
is
bit
kind
a
of like
form
hip hop,
of
right?
rap.
It's like music to rhythm and poetry.
And we do plan on
Yep.
coming out to China when things are clear. I think we had intended to make a trip out to poke around. Of course, something called the pandemic hit, and we were not able to do that. But we do hope to come and visit the ancestral village, because that would be
We
kind
got to
of
do
neat.
something with that data that Huihan supplied us with.
Exactly. We want to, even if we just take a picture in front of a building that used to be where your father lived. But we're going to move on to Grant, and we'll be coming back to all our panelists with some more questions. Thanks, Huihan, for that insight. Grant, you are on the board of the California Genealogical Society. You also previously worked for the Angel Island Immigration Station Foundation, which is when we first met you, because we didn't realize Angel Island was where Baldwin's family members, great grandparents and grandmother, had to actually be interrogated coming in and out of the port of San Francisco. Even though, as you say, Baldwin,
we lived there our entire lives and saw the island across the bay, and we had no idea that our ancestors were there. Actually, we took my father and my mother over to Angel Island to take a look at it, and we kind of looked at the areas and compared it to what we found at Nara, and it's like, oh, this is probably the location where these documents that we found at Nara that my grandfather, grandmother were sitting.
Yeah, so that was very eye-opening to us as well. And Grant, I know you've been involved with several different family historical organizations. How can these various organizations be a good resource to help people in the research? Because, I think John had mentioned earlier too about genealogical societies. And honestly, again, before we went on this trek into his family history, we didn't even know family history organizations, genealogical society. We didn't know any of this existed. Can you share some insight of how these can be helpful resources?
Sure, I'm happy to do that. As you mentioned earlier, I'm on the board of the California Genealogical Society, which has been around since the 19th century in the Bay Area. But wherever people are, chances are there's a genealogical society. And I'm just going to also enter something into the chat, which a lot of resources that I've accumulated over time. The local genealogical societies will not necessarily have anything on Chinese American history, but if you have something to present to them, I've found groups would love to hear your stories as well. They will teach you a lot of great things on how to become a better genealogist, like documenting, making sure that what you're saying is real. Because if you hear it one place, it doesn't mean it's true. You've got to, try to confirm that information. They'll have workshops on DNA, on using different software, to track your family information and so on. Genealogists are some of the most helpful people I've ever met. They love to share their information. And the groups I've mentioned, both in the Bay Area and in Southern California, now that you mentioned the pandemic, now that we have the pandemic, they've gone online, and you can find a lot of great resources on their websites. If you join, you will have access to all their information, and they're friends of mine and relatives in both the Bay Area and LA who are voluntarily running these wonderful organizations that have all kinds of great information to help in your searches. And then I also moderate an email group that I have a link there. People post questions and they say, I'm having a hard time finding, this information or learning what I got from the National Archives. Is it true? Or, where would they have these questions? And so it's there's all kinds of resources out there, as Marissa mentioned, at the National Archives. There's all kinds of great things. Along with the case files, there's, if you want to dig really deep, there's like departure records, and you can find that. I found family members in there. And you should be able to, and I mentioned there's one other site that I just learned about that if you're trying to talk to your family, which is really the best place to start, find parents or grandparents, if they're around, there's tips on how to do oral histories on a new site called ourapaheritage.com. I'm pretty sure it's .com or .org, but it's by a former reporter and current lawyer named Stephen Lee, whose mission is to tell the stories, have Asian Americans tell their stories to get them out to as many people as possible. And he's got tips on how to do your own oral histories and how to talk to family members. And sometimes, as Felicia Lowe found in her film, Chinese Couplets, sometimes your parents won't talk to you. They might talk to your kids. They might realize that the grandkids can tell the story, can listen better than you can. So I really encourage, if you're having a hard time getting through to your parents, maybe trying a different family member to ask, or especially your kids. So I encourage that.
Yeah, who was the secret weapon to get your dad to talk?
Yeah, our secret weapon to get my dad to talk was you.
It was me. It was the in-law.
Everything you saw in our film with my dad talking, it was because I got kicked out of the house.
Yeah. he likes me better. Yeah. Well, and to kind of continue on that, you know, what we found is I think Baldwin had a tendency to ask his dad, like, well, what happened? Like, what did you do? What did you do? And I think I stopped and maybe took a little bit more empathetic approach and, you know, asked him kind of, well, what was it like and how did you feel? You know, where I think he ended up opening up a little bit more about the hardships. And then he kind of went into the details, as opposed to if, you know, Baldwin asked about a fact, it would just be a very short answer. Well, I came in through San Francisco, and then that was the end of the conversation, you know. So there are definitely different tactics to do that. And also, I will just mention that there's a lot of other genealogical societies around the country that are of any subgroup. You know, if you're Irish, if you're African American, there's almost a group for everybody. If you're New England, if you're in the South, and so certainly. Researching on that, and I know like the National Genealogical Society also has a lot of links on their website as well. And Facebook groups. I know some of you might be here because you are part of one of those Facebook groups and might have seen a posting about this panel today. Okay, here's a question that I want to ask all the panelists here. What are some other helpful tools and insight you can give that can help someone make progress in their family research? Grant, you mentioned a little bit, if you know, a few resources. How about some of the others? John, Marissa, Huihan, other favorite tools or insight that you can give to our audience today?
I think it's really individual because it depends on where you're searching. Some locations have more records than others. And what I found really helpful is to be in contact with local people who have expertise in that area. Now, personally, my records are all in the Netherlands, and so I rely a lot on not only FamilySearch, because we've got a really good collection of Dutch records. Right after World War II, we went in and we microfilmed practically every church record and every civil registration record that exists. Subsequently, they have gone back, and microfilm obviously is black and white. And so the Dutch themselves have gone back and re-imaged many of them in color, and they've also indexed them. So it's really easy to do Dutch research. And if you kind of understand the local culture and who to go to, there's some great genealogists that are in the Netherlands that are very helpful and provide a lot of tools. So I go to them, ask them questions, or look on their blogs and see what they're saying and where to go look. So really, it's local is my experience. And I found that the same thing in the United States, as not only as we go out and try to set up projects to gather records, but as we talk to local genealogists, they know exactly what records to use and where to look and how to find the different locations that you can find records.
That's a great suggestion. And I think one of the questions actually touches on this, because someone was asking about John Bassey in our film and how we came across him, right? And that's kind of like exactly what you said. We went local and we met up with Emily. We found her and she's like, well, let me contact some people that might know. And then she contacted John Bassey and some others. And then we met at the museum, and exactly what you said. We started off local and it stayed local for a long time, and everyone just talked to people, and then we just found more and more information. That was that turned everything on.
Yeah, and I mean, to kind of piggyback off of that, I feel like the smaller the town too, like the more local it is, the
Oh,
easier
yeah.
the easier, right? Like, I mean, if you go into New York City Hall or LA City Hall, it's probably going to be a long way to get answers. But Baldwin, your brother Edwin, called Cleveland City Hall, and they're the ones who told us about Emily Jones and the Mississippi Delta Chinese Heritage Museum, as well as where the location of the cemetery was. And so, yes, local people are very, very helpful. Yeah, Marissa, Huihan, Grant, other
Yeah.
favorite sources?
I mean, I guess I would just, for anyone who's starting out, I would just kind of echo what Grant was saying in terms of looking at things about doing interviews with family members, because really, the urgency to doing family history sometimes is the fact that you still have people around who have this knowledge and these memories. When I worked at NARA, folks who would be walking in the door, just getting started with their family history would often say, well, I'm starting this because, my father just passed away, or I just lost my grandmother. And, I never thought to ask them these questions. And so now I'm, kind of doing that work. So I would always, encourage folks to start with the people around you, start with the elders in your family, and make sure that that's really the focus of your research. Like I, started doing this back in high school and college, and I wish someone had given me that advice back then, because, even though I'm like, relatively young in this work, there were so many folks around back, then who I wish I could have asked these questions of.
Yeah, I actually think I know more about Baldwin's family now after doing this film than I do about my own grandparents, who I lived with and grew up with. And so
Because you didn't
I
talk
echo
to
that.
them about
I
this.
didn't. No, they were just grandpa and grandma, and I never bothered to ask them about their lives and their history.
Well, this leads me to a question to all the panelists too. It's like, I mean, this is a great point. We start off with asking questions, right? But that's just for ourselves. And let's say we get the answers, like we've documented answers from my family. How do we find ways to share it with other people that might also be interested in what we have just documented? I mean, my stuff is not at the National Archives. It's probably not going to be at FamilySearch. It's not going to be anywhere where the public can find it, but there might be a relative somewhere down the line that might want to get my information that I've collected. How do we make that available? Oh, it sounds like somebody's got.
Yeah, I've got a suggestion. So
right, John.
FamilySearch.org is a free website. And there's several elements to the website. One is obviously we have a lot of records, images and indexes and all that kind of stuff. But we also have we call it one global tree. And basically it's one tree that everybody puts their names in. There's several billion names in this interconnected tree already. You have the possibility of attaching images, and also stories to the individual in the tree that you might want to focus on. So if you have information about your grandfather and you have a number of photos, you can attach those photos to your grandpa. You can interview your grandpa and take that voice, take his voice, tape it, and you can attach that interview to his persona in the tree. So all of a sudden you start to gather information that is very deep and interesting. Another element that I just learned about this last week, and that is that we have a number of different activities, and one of them is called Record My Story. And what we've done is we've got a number of different topical areas, and under each topical area, there are a number of questions, and the system just asks you the question, and you can push a red button and you can start to answer the question, and it instantly records everything that you're saying. You've got about 5 minutes for each question. If you were to go through all of that, you really, in essence, have created a little family history of yourself or your grandparents or your parents or whoever it is that you want to connect with. And that stays. FamilySearch is a nonprofit. We're not going to go out of business. We're not going to be bought or sold by anybody. And so that will be there in perpetuity for your children and your children's children and so on to be able to access. So they'll be able to have a rich heritage that they can go back to and learn a little bit. And I just recorded my first little story. It was, what am I really good at? And I didn't know what to say. I thought, well, okay, I can do some Dutch research. So I told a little story that I felt would be interesting for my grandkids. At some point, hopefully they'll look at my little section in the website and they'll say, oh, he says he's good at something. I wonder what it is. And then they'll listen to me telling them in my own voice what was in, what I was good at. So it's a great tool. There's a lot of different things that are exciting and interesting, but that helps you to preserve and protect. And it's not hidden in a closet in my house that maybe when I, pass away, that somebody's just cleaning the house out and everything gets thrown away. This is actually preserved and protected for all time.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
that's actually great to know about those resources. Other panelists, any other resources you want to jump in to add to what we've already shared?
Yeah, sure. I think just building on what everybody before me has said, first of all, I completely agree with, especially starting with family and the importance that John just mentioned with about preserving and keeping the stories for the next generations. And I think the more platforms there are, the better. And so my China Roots, we got two pillars. Basically, one is the offline, very custom research that we would describe and what we did for Baldwin. And the other one is the online platform. And the online platform consists also of two things. One is you can search. So we have 20,000 plus clan books already focusing on Southern China. And you can search by name. And when you've done that, when you found actually, so this is also going back to the question of how do you start? What we're building is basically a tool for non-Chinese readers or non-Chinese speakers that can start with the Romanized version of their ancestors' names, which is a very complicated process for everybody will know who has started doing Chinese family history research. But we have a database of names that help you find the characters to your name and then search for those characters inside the 20,000+ books that we have. So that's the searching aspect, which is a very easy way to start. Then if you found that information, you can preserve it through family websites. So in a similar way to what John described, what we feel very strongly about is leaving that legacy and preserving the stories, especially when we visit villages and we hear stories from old grandfathers and grandmothers about ancestors who left and how they sent money back or how they returned in the 80s. All these stories are pure gold, and we want to preserve them for our children and for our grandchildren to come. So we have on our online platform, you can create your own user account. You can keep your stories there. There's a family tree, there's a library where you can basically save your stories, your pictures, your ancestors, linking it to the source material that you found on our database. So the clan books, in the future there'll be cemetery records, ancestral tablets. So basically you have one place where you can keep everything and leave it for the next generation.
Yeah, it seems like technology is really becoming a great asset in terms of helping people organize their family research, and even being, tools where you don't have to leave your home. I mean, we didn't know anything. Like, we just drove to Mississippi trying to find a grave, and we didn't know there was a website called findagrave.com. We could have just punched in Baldwin's grandfather and great grandfather's names in to find the cemetery.
Wasted a lot of gas just driving back and forth looking for, like, is it that one? Is it that?
I have to say that nothing replaces the personal experience of actually going, right? I mean, you could have, and it would have saved you many hours, but it would also have deprived you of an experience that, that's why we're sitting here, right? Because you went through that personal experience and a journey, and it makes it all the more deep and personal when you actually visit.
Right. It's a much better experience than just going on Google Earth and like zooming down, right? and looking at it. We have a question that I think is a great question that is similar to one that I was going to ask you all as well. While some family members are extremely excited about genealogy research, others are not. Some genealogy research unearths uncomfortable truths. How do you prepare to navigate that? And before the rest of you answer, I'll give a couple anecdotes, because I know we made a documentary about Baldwin's family, and we did it because we unearthed some interesting truths. I mean, some of them were harsh too, about the impact of the Chinese Exclusion Act. But at the end of the day, his grandfather was a good guy. And, if he had been a jerk and like a villain, I don't know if we would have made a documentary, right? And also, I think with some of these broaching these conversations, what we've heard from a lot of people is that our film has been an important tool to have people be on the same page to kind of unearth some of these conversations that maybe you wouldn't just normally go up to somebody after a family dinner, go like, so tell me about grandpa. But, sharing and watching the film together or talking about the film together has actually had a lot of people tell us they've been able to open up family members because they've seen somebody like Baldwin's dad, who is very, very, stoic, be able to open up, and it's encouraged them. Let's hear from the rest of the panel too. Like, what are some what are some ways that you can navigate? I know Grant had mentioned a website, earlier. What are some other ways that you guys have found personally, or in your experience in hearing about other methods to unearth the hard nuts to crack?
Or to encourage people to not be afraid to share those things.
To kind of add on to that, like, what are some other, or how do you also overcome some challenges? I know one of them that we encountered was some of the spellings of names, and even just tracking down the right names of people.
Maybe just to react on the every family has darker pages of their history and brighter pages, right? Just as every human has characteristics that we like about ourselves and others that we don't really like. So does that translate to family histories in general? We actually, it's not uncommon for us to receive basically requests to find people's family history so that they can be linked to whatever emperor or celebrity or brilliant person. And that's sometimes how it starts. What is most interesting to me is that when people go on the journey and discover it's about connecting with stories and with people, a deeper and more authentic layer comes into play that people often don't really realize themselves when they start. And so often when they hear stories that aren't nice, and there are many of those, because mostly people didn't uproot their lives and move to another place 1,000 miles down over the oceans just for fun. So it's often there is trauma, but very often the first reaction, yes, might be a bit of a turnoff. But then when they process it and they actually find out that these are real stories, real people, and this is what their ancestors went through, and they actually process the real stories with all their darkness, the actual experience becomes one that is a lot more honest and deeper, and they tend to let go of that, oh, I want to be linked to that emperor, and there's actually no more talk of it after or during the research journey. And I find that really interesting, because I think of course we all want to prefer to see the bright sides, but what good is that at the end of the day if you just want to see the bright sides? And I think that insight of, okay, my family history may have darker pages, but it's my history and it's what I have become, and now I have the decision to form my life how I want. I mean, I find that very powerful, and that's sort of one of the things that make me love what we do, to help people, I guess, grow. I don't want to sound degrading, but I mean to go through a journey where they see that and accept that there are things that are less pleasant.
That's a really great. I feel like that's a really great story, because like we have a couple of friends who both did their genealogy. One's Black, one's white, and they traced their family back to where, surprisingly, our friend that's Black found that he was a descendant of slaves, and his friend traced himself back and ironically found himself being the descendant of a plantation and a slave owner, which owned his friend's great grandfather.
Oh, wow.
Right?
So they became friends, and then they didn't know when they were friends until they traced that they had that connection, that one family owned the other.
Yeah, so now it's led them to grow in their friendship, and now they have this dark history in the past, but they're using it to talk about racial reconciliation and letting people know about this dark past, but then how they were able to change it and effectively do something positive for the future. So it's a great story you have, Huihan, about, like, people trying to trace it back, and if it's dark, it's dark. What can we do about it?
Yeah. Marissa, were you going to jump in and say something as well?
Yeah, I wanted to first read out something that Eric, a colleague at FamilySearch, put in the chat, which is, if you're afraid of skeletons, stay out of the closets. Thanks for that, Eric. But because of the history of exclusion and the ways that folks got around Chinese exclusion, and the legacy that's left in our families, even though the Exclusion Act was repealed, 70 years ago, that still has that legacy still holds in our families. And I think that, for folks who are doing Chinese American genealogical research, that's just a kind of a reality. I know of folks who have done research, have been told things by their elders, who are told those things on the grounds that they will never share those things. So that's very real. And, that kind of discomfort and those kinds of truths are often things that you just have to respect, that, there might be some things that you find that folks will confide in you, and, you will hold those things confidential. That's just something that I know, to be true in the kind of research that we do.
Yeah, kind of a related question that Cindy asked is, was it common for paper sons to hide that fact even from other people in the Chinese community? And I would say, yes, that wasn't that?
They weren't just hiding it from non-Chinese people, but they would even hide it from other Chinese people. Is that common?
Oftentimes, Grant, maybe you can chip in here. I know that oftentimes folks would, or they might not. That you might have, one name that your child used at school, that was their paper name, but, when you went to your family association dinners, well, everyone at that dinner knew that you weren't a Wong, that you were really an Ing. So, there were definitely layers, I think, within the community where folks knew certain things to not be true, and held those things in confidence.
And Grant, can you actually help maybe the audience? Some of the audience here may not know what a paper son is. Would you mind giving a quick definition of a paper son, Grant?
Sure. During the Exclusion Acts, one of the few ways you could come in is if you were the son or daughter of someone who was born here, or said he was born here. And so and then the earthquake and fire of 1906 destroyed all the records. So a lot of the Chinese who were here said, oh, I was born here and I went back to China with my family and then I came back. So I'm a citizen. And so therefore they could bring their families over. Sometimes they would say they had 6 children, and often they would say they were boys because they could sell those slots to other families. And my grandfather was one. His real name was Gong, and he came in as an Ao. Eventually he took his brothers. It's a whole another story, and how we became Dids. But I could talk for 10 minutes. But yeah, so a lot of people had to have these identities which they hid because they, if the authorities discovered it, they could be deported for immigration fraud and so on. And back to your other question, I remember Lai King Wong told the story that her mother had to say that she was the sister of her father, and that she was her auntie. So the kids had to get used to calling her mother auntie. But so everyone in Chinatown knew that they were not really sister and brother, obviously, if they, were living together as husband and wife, but they had to still use that term wherever they went. And so that made things really difficult.
Yeah, there's a lot to the names. I mean, most people today are a little bit more open about the paper names, but there was a period where a lot of people were very fearful that, they would be kicked out of this country, for the paper names, or just even living in shame because so for some people, it's still a little bit of a touchy subject, for sure. And go ahead, Grant.
No, my aunt was born here, and she married a paper son, and she wouldn't talk about anything about her past until, she carried it to her death. So her son never was able to find out much about her past. And
that is one of the unfortunate things, that the policies like that, or having paper sons, is that it prevented a lot of people from sharing their family history. Right. We are going to open it up for some more questions. We've got a lot of questions coming in, so I want to make sure we get to that. But this has been an awesome conversation so far. Someone did ask, are there some useful websites on this chat? Are you planning to include it somewhere on our website? What I'll also do is, some of it may go on our website, but what I'll also do is do a roundup of some of the links that people have been dropping, and in kind of a follow-up email after the event's over, I will email it to everyone. So, those of you who are frantically trying to copy and paste or save the chat, I will be sure to do a roundup of all those resources that we mentioned here today. This question, I think, John, might be for you. How do you organize your volunteers for indexing projects?
Yeah, that's a good question. So it is really people that come forward and want to participate. So on our website, there's a tab that says indexing. And you can just go to that tab. You can choose the project that you want to work on by language or by location. We have lots of projects that are available at any given point in time. And on any given day, we will index about 1 million names. And the organization is basically done at the back end as we prepare the different record sets for indexing. So as you all know, a record will have multiple different data points in there. We're not going to index every single data point, but we'll index the things that are most important. And that makes it easiest. It makes it a better experience for somebody to be able to find their ancestor and identify that ancestor from somebody else who may have the same name. So that's the organization is done at the back end. It's not really reaching out. We do have some interesting things that happen periodically. So every 10 years, the United States Census comes out. And so the 1940 census came out in 2012. I was privileged to be at NARA to pick up the census at midnight on April 1st. And it was a couple of hard drives. We took it over to a data center and loaded it up and sent it out to people. And we had contacted, again, going local, contacted local genealogy societies in states throughout the United States. And it basically became a competition as people said, oh, I think we can get Mississippi done before they can get Arkansas done. And so we kept track of that, and we kept kind of a counter going as people got really excited. And within 4 months, we indexed over 140 million names. And that was just amazing. It was a miracle. I mean, we didn't think that we'd be able to do it that fast, but it was just the effort. The National Archives helped a lot because they made a lot of publicity about it. The National Archivist, David Ferriero, spoke at a lot of conferences, and he would mention this indexing project that was going on with the 1940 census. And so that's periodically we'll have something like that. That's a major push. I can see something like that happening for the 1950 census next year. So kind of keep your eyes open for any news that's going to be coming. But a lot of times these are local projects that we have going on. And so it's people that say, okay, I want to pay it forward a little bit. I've received so much from FamilySearch and from other organizations that made it possible for me to find my family. I want to make it easier for somebody else. And so they'll go to the indexing website and they will find a project and they'll do the indexing. And some people anyway. So that's what we do.
That's a lot. We have a related question. Do you know how the estimate for how long it will take to take for the 1950 census to be indexed? Depends on how much competition is incentive.
Yes, yeah. I think it'll be done fairly rapidly. I have a sneaking suspicion it's going to be quicker than the 1940 census. So I'd like to tell you, but I don't know yet.
Well, I have a question because, I mean, when we're talking about all these records of people, and we live in an age right now where privacy is probably not even a word anymore, right? What's privacy? Is there even such thing as privacy with all these records that we're talking about when people are no longer around? Can people not make their records unavailable? Can they do that, or is that not possible? Or how does that all work with privacy?
Yeah,
Anybody?
I think it depends on where I'm sorry to jump in on this, but it depends on where you live. So it's the laws of the country that will determine those privacy regulations. So in Europe, there are places where you have the right to be forgotten even after you're dead. But in the US, primarily, every state has its own what we call cutoff dates. So that how long before records become public records. In some states, like in Ohio, marriage records are public records all the way up to the present. Other states restrict marriage records, and you can't make them public until after 50 years have passed. And birth records can be 100 years or 110 years. Death records, even though somebody's dead, some places require you to wait 25 years before you can actually make those records publicly available. So it just depends on the location. And we're very sensitive to privacy rules and regulations. There are bits of information such as social security numbers that are on a number of different records. Of course, I remember some years back, we used to have a social security numbers printed on our checks. It was part of a form of ID. So as much concern as we have today, 30 years ago, wasn't a big deal. And so there's this kind of ebb and flow that happens with privacy type of things, but we're very sensitive to fraud. We're very sensitive to all those kinds of issues and are careful to abide by whatever the local laws and regulations require us to. And sometimes you can be a family member and see a record that may not be public. And so you should check and see and ask the local court or wherever it is that you're trying to find your records. If you can find them, if they're not publicly available, they may be available to family members.
Yeah. Well, that's very interesting. We also have some questions regarding some family clan libraries. Somebody asked, this might be more for Huihan, but feel free if anyone else wants to chime in. Are the family clan libraries in China a reliable source of tracing family ancestry?
Okay, so reliable as in whether it's fake information or authentic or like true accurate information, I would say it's generally reliable. Because they don't, even though they would charge for a clan book that you would buy, it's not enough money for it to be a business that fakes would make money off. But the question is more which clan association where. So if for instance you have the clan association that is based and centered around a particular county that you're from, or even a town, even better, then definitely, then they're a good institution to turn to. Assuming you would speak Chinese, because they tend to not speak English. But if it, for instance, if it's like a national, or if it's based in Shanghai and you're from the south somewhere, then I would say you can always try your luck, but your chances of success are a lot lower.
Yeah, and here's another question regarding Chinese characters. See, somebody said, the Chinese who went to Guyana and other parts of the Caribbean in the 1800s had their names misspelled as they disembarked, similar to pretty much everywhere around the world, which made it difficult to trace our ancestors. Without understanding Chinese characters, how does one even begin their journey? I think you were starting to share that a little bit about that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the starting point, right? Names. And if I look around all the names present on this chat, like 99% are not the spellings, like the using the Roman alphabet are not the spellings that correlate to Mandarin Pinyin. And that's due to a variety of factors. One is typically people were from the south, and at least the ancestors of the people today that were born and raised outside China. So they had a dialect, whether it's Standard Cantonese or Toisanese or Hakka or Fujianese, Hokkien, that they used to say their name, to pronounce their name. And then when they arrived in a migration destination, it depended on the language that was spoken there, how it was perceived to the person writing it down. So there's the dialect that was used to utter the name, and then there's the language, Spanish in the Philippines, Dutch in Indonesia, English in Malaysia, Singapore, English, of course, in the US. What that was important in deciding how the bureaucrat or whoever is the person was that wrote the name down first would hear the name and then phonetically write it down. So those two key variables, the original dialect and the language that was spoken in the host country, I guess, those are the key variables. And what we're now building is a database with many millions of Romanized variants per character, per name character. So that will allow you to basically type in the Romanized version of the ancestral name that you have. Then basically with the help of the dialect that that your grandfather spoke, because very often people do know what dialect their grandfather spoke. And based on the fact where they went to, our system will then help you filter down what the likely characters are. And
well, I was going to say kind of another hack is like, if you do happen to have Chinese characters written somewhere, Google Translate has this function where, if you're not able to copy and paste, like if it's handwritten, they have a camera function where you can actually shoot a picture of the Chinese characters and it will try to do a translation for you. I mean, it's not foolproof because, especially if it's something that's handwritten only, it might interpret it differently, but it is, I don't read or write Chinese. So it's a kind of a hack that I've learned to get around in terms of trying to read and translate Chinese in places. So
if you're lucky and you could find the gravestone with Chinese writing on the back in the US, that will give you the real name as well as often the hometown.
That's a good one.
That's definitely a good one. And this is kind of another related question. What are some good resources for finding out the history of China? And this might be more directed to Marissa and Grant, but particularly in the Toishan region during the time where people were immigrating to the US.
I guess some good I got a lot of my learning and teaching through the Roots program. I'll put in a plug for the Roots program. And one of the founders of the Roots program was a Chinese American community historian named Huihan Lie. A lot of his writings are available for free online through a Huihan Lie digital archive, and I'll put a link to that in the chat.
Cool.
Yeah, Roots is great. They have a village database that Friends of Roots have put together. It's just amazing.
The history of China, I would also say, I mean, it sounds very basic, but Googling some of the time periods is actually very helpful. There's a lot of articles that might like pop up if you have an idea of what period you're trying to cover. Or what we did, again, because we didn't know any better, we found some, Asian history professors and just started talking with them. I mean, there's obviously different books, and I know sometimes it's hard to like search through books if you're looking for specific things, but yes, if you can befriend an East Asian, studies professor somewhere, or Chinese history professor somewhere, you could actually just ask your question directly. Maybe we'll have to do a follow-up panel, dealing with the history side of things.
Oh, go ahead. Wait,
just quickly, one thing to add. I think for Chinese history, especially local history in China, the type of document that you would like is what they call gazetteers. So they're county level, city level, and provincial level gazetteers. And these are documents maintained by government institutions, and they're literally encyclopedias for specific regions. So they have political chapters, social, cultural chapters, economic chapters, political chapters about, the Taiping Rebellion in the towns that were belonging to this county, how many people from which town were actually participating in the rebellions, or were Hakka, or economics. What are the key crops that were harvested, and what were the months that they were actually that the seeds would be sowed and harvested? Social, cultural. What are the key festivals? How are they celebrated? Everybody celebrates Chinese New Year, but also everybody does it differently. How is the chicken actually prepared? It goes down to the recipe level of the oils. It's very detailed. So one of the things that we do is combine the Zupu, the personal history from a Zupu, from a clan book, with the general regional history from a gazetteer, and that's what really allows you to go back in time and really and experience what life would have been like for your great grandfather.
Now, are those is that in Chinese? Those documents?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I've come across like literally one or two out of many hundreds that were translated to English. But yeah, that's very, very rare.
Right. So
in English, you call it a gazetteer.
Can you put that in the chat? Because I don't know how to spell that.
And how would that be written in Chinese? What is that Chinese word?
Okay, well, we're going to answer. I know we want to be respectful. Oh, gazetteers. Okay, somebody else does know.
Oh, okay.
Cool. Okay. Forgive us. Like I said, we were accidental genealogists. We didn't get that far. We didn't make it to China. So
we didn't get it to the gazetteers.
Before I have our panelists give kind of a last word and last remark, wanted to kind of share how you can stay in contact with us. You can go to our website, fareastdeepsouth.com. We actually do have a resources page, and I will try to actually add some of the links that somebody, some of that were mentioned here to some of our resources page, but we do have existing links to the National Archives, to FamilySearch, and some other resources. So to subscribe to our newsletter. You can follow us on social media if you'd like to learn what's coming up next with our film, and of course us individually. We also have a podcast called Love, Discovery, and Dim Sum, where we talk about little known history as it relates to current events, and we discuss race and culture from an Asian American lens. So if you'd like to learn more about that, and of course sometimes we do talk about your family history
and food,
more stuff and more food. And if you'd like to learn more about our First Class initiative, we are trying to get our film Far East Deep South into more schools to broaden the way American history is taught. And more importantly, I think seeing a family story, what a lot of people say is that it kind of personalizes now history, and all our family stories really make up history. And so just like all our panelists encouraged, tell your story. You don't have to make a fancy documentary like we did, but please tell your stories, record those stories, whether it's on paper, whether it's on your iPhones. We need to collect these family stories for future generations, so that we know that they will know that we existed and what we contributed in this world. Lastly, if you're interested in bringing our film to schools, please reach out to us as well. Our film is also available on Canopy Canopy, through the university system, and through New Day Films. I want to thank FamilySearch and California Genealogical Society and My China Roots for loaning us a few people here. And of course, to our panelists. And why don't I start with John? Any last words and advice you want to give to our audience here?
Yeah, first of all, I want to thank you for the work that you've done to bring out this story. I watched the film. I mean, there were portions where I cried. It was just so touching to see your connection to your roots and connecting back with your family, and then the journey that you took to be able to do that. And it inspired me to continue to search. The other thing that I just would like to say is that sometimes it's worth slowing down in the journey. I'm kind of a try to find as many people as possible type of person. And I slow down sometimes and I go, wait a minute, what happened in this family? There are 5 boys and they all have the same name. What's going on here? And it was a practice in Western Europe that if a child died, the next one of the same sex would get the same name. And so then I put myself in the position of my ancestors, and it creates a whole different experience as I look at that and experience it. So slow down in your search and reach out to everyone that you can find to connect with them and enjoy that journey. Thank you
so
for
much
allowing
for
us to
that.
participate. Yeah, thank you.
Marissa, last words, advice?
Just thanks for inviting me to be involved in this panel. I also enjoyed your film when I saw it at CamFest last year. I guess the thing that my bandwagon, having 2 young kids, is to encourage folks to involve the younger generations of your family in your family history research and to ignite their passion that way.
Absolutely. We try to do that with our daughter, and I think it's very, very important to start early. Grant.
Thanks again for having me. I do have relatives in Arkansas, so I want to, we're going to be on a Zoom call with them soon, and I can learn more about their history. This is kind of related to the past question about tracing women's stories. The picture in my background, I like to use it because my family had it for a long time. I didn't know who it was. My uncle passed away. He was a pack rat. He had it in his possession. So I asked everyone, I wrote to China. I said, do you know who these people are? I asked relatives who had come here. No one answered me. And then we met this cousin. My cousin said, oh, we've got this cousin, Howie, who lives in Sacramento. Oh, how come I haven't met him? Oh, he's been here for 20 years. What? So we went to meet him, and I brought this picture, and I said, do you happen to know who they are? And he said, oh, I think we might. Let me ask my mom. And so he gave me all this information, all the people on the screen now.
Wow.
You see the daughters, they're like my grandfather's sisters. And he said, oh, this picture was taken in Vietnam. I go, our family lived in Vietnam. And then later I did a DNA test. I'm part Vietnamese, like 8%. I said,
Wow.
it's crazy. And so I'd say that goes to show, just ask questions. Don't be afraid to ask family members. Tell everyone you're interested in anything. And, my cousin had this information for 20 years. We had this cousin, but he never told me. So do your search and don't give up. There's lots of people who can help you. And, it's very rewarding. So, and people have said before, carry it on to your kids and your grandkids. And it's very satisfying.
Thank you. That's cool.
Huihan?
Well, most of all, thank you guys. So Baldwin, Larissa, and also Emily for just making this beautiful film and just organizing this panel. Is very exciting. Yeah, I'm going back. I keep going in the beginning when everybody wrote where they were from, just like in one line. It was just, I'm still sort of in my head processing those things. I want to ask everybody where they're from and what their stories are. So I'm half sort of frustrated. I want to hear your stories. But no, anyway, it's been really fun to be part of the panel. And thanks, Baldwin, Larissa, and Emily.
Yeah, well, we're so glad you were able to join us all the way from Beijing. And Emily Jones, do you want to have a last word as well? People like seeing your face because they recognize you from the film. Somebody mentioned that it felt like they were seeing celebrities seeing you in Baldwin.
Again, I am so impressed with everything that has come out from y'all's visit, especially in small towns. Sometimes the history is still locked within the people. Folks don't think it's important enough to write their own histories down or to tell anybody else about them. until people come looking for them. And so thank you for validating this area's memories in a lot of people's minds, and helping my job get a little easier. So thank y'all for what you invested in us.
It's just been, fun to have everyone here. Thank you from joining from all over the world. We have people from Singapore, from Canada tonight, or this morning, depending on where you're at. So we're really, really grateful for this interest, and, stay tuned. I know we plan on doing something else with Huihan, and I think possibly doing something with Roots Tech and FamilySearch down the line. So definitely stay tuned for additional events like this.